Okay, everyone, I'm going to get started. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Pamela Robinson. I'm professor and I'm also the interim academic director of Toronto Metropolitan University City Building Institute. I'd like to welcome you today for a session that we're doing in collaboration with the Urban Analytics Institute at our university. What we're going to do today is I'm going to do a few administrative matters, then we're going to turn it over to our team who's here to run the show. It's important for us to start today by acknowledging that we're in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bounds them together to protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this space in a spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Today on Remembrance Day, I think it's especially important to remember the vital contributions of our Indigenous community members to the work that our government has done both here and abroad. And as an urban planner, I would like to acknowledge the systemically racist and colonial practice that my profession has imposed on people in their communities. And I, as an individual and as a member of our School of Urban and Regional Planning, are working actively day by day to start to address those issues. You'll also know that our university has recently changed its name as part of an act of truth and reconciliation. You can learn more about that on our website. Today, we're really excited to welcome you for a discussion with the Urban Analytics Institute, in which the colleagues and members of the Institute are going to share some of their research. It's one of many urban-focused research centers at Toronto Metropolitan University, which we pride ourselves on, and it's dedicated to pursuing unique research into specialized topics focused on urban issues, which is part of the series of webinars that we're hosting. I'll hand things over to the Institute's director in just a moment, but a few housekeeping notes. Today's presentation includes about 25 minutes of panel discussion led by the Institute's research director, Dr. Murtaza Haider, and there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions, probably 10 or 15 minutes worth, that will be selected from the audience. On Zoom, there's a Q&A function at the bottom, which you'll be able to see. If you put your questions in there, other people can see what you're interested in. It also lets people to prioritize the questions that they think are the most interesting and the most important to them. This session is being recorded, which is great for posterity. It also lets you share it and come back and revisit it. It'll be posted on our website in a matter of days. And if you subscribe to our newsletter, then you'll have firsthand access right in the moment to the events that we're hosting moving forward, as well as research that we're sharing. Finally, since it's Remembrance Day today, we're going to be ending the session promptly at 10:50 to allow those of us, including me, to attend events to commemorate the important work of their veterans and our families. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Haider. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Welcome, folks, and it's my pleasure. I hope that you can hear me, and with that assumption, I will continue. My name is Murtaza Haider. I am a professor of real estate management at the Toronto School of Management, and I am speaking to you today from actually McGill University, where I'm actually housed right now, sitting in my former office, which I had from 2001 to 2006. It is my pleasure to introduce the panel, but before I do this, I need to figure out a way to know that I am being heard. Is there a way for me to know that you can hear me?
We can hear you.
Lovely, fantastic. Okay, so the Urban Analytics Institute is a institute for data-centric research in urban and housing and transportation matters. And today we are showcasing three of our researchers whose focus is inherently in housing markets. So alphabetically, I'm going to introduce first Professor Kiana Basiri. Professor Basiri is an assistant professor in the School of Business Management at the Toronto School of Management. Her focus is research is in the real estate area, and she's a professor in the real estate management department. And her approach is using econometric tools and statistical analysis to understand the relationship between housing and credit markets. She does a lot of work on mortgage defaults and income falsification in mortgages. Her primary research interests are in real estate economics, housing policy, household finance, consumer bankruptcies, and default. Before she came to Ryerson or Toronto Metropolitan University, she was a senior specialist in housing research division at the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. So welcome, Kiana. Our other panelist is Dr. Anson Ho. Professor Ho is an assistant professor at again in the real estate management department, his research includes consumer finance, housing, and macroeconomics. And before he came to Toronto Metropolitan University, he was a senior economist in the financial stability department at the Bank of Canada, and formerly an assistant professor of economics at Kansas State University. And finally, we have Meet Shah. Meet Shah is a second-year doctoral student at the real estate department, and he has a master's also from Ted Rogers School of Management, and his research interests are housing supply, real estate finance, and housing policy. So welcome all. And the way we will function today is that we will start with a series of questions which we have discussed earlier. So I'm going to start with the first topic, and basically we are addressing housing supply challenges in Canada. It has come to most governments' attention that housing supply is a challenge, and therefore from the federal, provincial, and local governments, you could see several initiatives focused on improving housing supply in Canada. So the first question is for Professor Basiri, and the question is, realizing that there is a housing deficit in Canada, how large is the housing deficit, and are there different estimates, like are there different governments or agencies or research centers coming up with different estimates? How many homes do we have to build to address this housing deficit? Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. It's my pleasure to be here today. Thank you so much for the question, Murtaza, and introduction. Of course, we all have seen a rapid house price escalation in CMAs, especially in Toronto and Vancouver. And this is the evidence that demand for housing exceeds the supply, which is what we call the housing deficit. 2/3 of this housing deficit gap is found to be in Ontario and British Columbia, where we have seen this province is facing a large decline in affordability in recent years. And as you mentioned, there has been a lot of reports. Government and housing expert has been calling for more and more housing construction across Canada to tackle these supply shortages. But how much exactly do we need to build? That's a hard question to answer. Just putting a number on that gap. And we have seen, as you mentioned, few reports that trying to put a number, and this, for example, ranges from $1.5 to $2 million, for example, for Ontario itself, to build new dwellings by 2031 to meet the demand generated by new households, and also to meet up for the previously unmet demand. I can add two things as you ask. So it's not only building more and more new dwellings that is important to shorten, but it's also what kind of dwelling we are building. It's also important. If we try to, first of all, build more than what we are expecting in terms of growth in number of households or our household formation, first, it helps to give the opportunity and enable households to better match between different type of housing needs they need. But it's also helpful to understand the need of those new population growth. Like if we are only trying to focus on how many more, and this results in just building, one type of, new dwellings, this will not help a mixing of our housing that we need, for a single young professional to all the way to big families. For example, if you're building condos, this is gonna put even more pressure on single detached houses, and those are important to consider on top of what the great job those reports have done to just put a number. That's what I can add.
Excellent. I mean, this is quite true that, for instance, CMHC mentioned in a recent report, maybe a couple of months ago, that in order to address the deficit, not only that we have to build more homes between now and 2030 to accommodate the increase in population, but the gap, that the deficit that is from the previous years, probably for the last 3 decades or 4. So we need to, perhaps, the way I recall it is that we need to build 3 million more homes above and beyond business as usual across Canada to be able to meet with the deficit. And your point is very right, that it's not just building any homes, it's not just building condominiums, as has been the case in Toronto. 85% of the new build in the city of Toronto has been condominiums. But what about the family-oriented housing? What about people, young families trying to get into the ownership market? So so your points, the way I see them, is that this is more nuanced than we think. So I'm going to move to Anson. And Anson, you have looked at some numbers, and what is your take on the housing deficit targets? When you look at them, you see the diversity of those targets. There are different ones coming. There is some probably there is some consensus, but what is your take on the size of the housing deficit?
Yeah, when we talk about housing deficit, we talk about millions of houses. It may be a bit distant from people's perception because we don't used to think about millions. So let's put things in other perspective. So when we think about Canada housing deficit, we are talking about, well, do people have places to live? So let's look at the number of dwellings per 1,000 people. Okay, in Canada, we have the lowest number of dwellings per 1,000 people among all Grade 7 countries, except in Italy that we don't have data. Okay, we are talking about in Canada, we have 426 dwellings per 1,000 people. Okay, well, on average, in other G7 countries, they have about 470 dwellings per 1,000 people. So we are talking about Canada being, we are lacking about 10% behind. Well, we haven't looked at the population growth so far. Okay, so in order just to catch up without accounting for future population growth, we are going to have to build about 1.8 million houses just to catch up with other G7 countries. But if you look within Canada, we have, as Kiana said, we have quite some inequalities, with some dispersion in terms of dwellings per 1,000 people. And needless to say, Ontario is the worst. Okay, we have about slightly less than 400 compared to the national average, 424 per 1,000 people. And if we just look at Toronto, because we're in Toronto Metropolitan area, so let's say Toronto is one of the worst metropolitan areas, one of the worst, biggest city in Canada. We have about 326 dwellings per 1,000 people compared to the national average, 424. So if we just neglect the quality, neglect the type of housing people want, we just don't have enough housing for people. People have to pack together, they have smaller spaces, and that's just not good.
Thank you. So this is quite interesting that even in Toronto, in the city of Toronto, the number of dwellings per 1,000 people is significantly lower than the national average for number of dwellings per 1,000 people. So the rate of housing supply in the city of Toronto is lower than it is, or the housing stock is, rate at which housing is occupied, it is lower than the rest of Canada. In fact, this is quite interesting because last year, around this time in November, we did a study and published it with Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And in that study, we showed that the rate of housing construction in the 70s was 10 to 12,000 new homes were being built for 1 million people in Canada. Right? That's 1970s. 10 to 12,000 new homes per 1 million people were being built every year in Canada. That rate declined from the early 70s to recently to 5,000 to 6,000 new homes per 1 million people. And so you can imagine that not only that our population is increasing, our rate of housing construction has declined, and as you mentioned, Anson, that there is even more scarcity in not just in Toronto, I would assume in other populous cities as well. Now, this brings us to a very interesting question, which I will put it to Meet. basically, when the three of us, Anson and I and Kiana, when we discussed, we said, well, there is a housing deficit. But my guess is that not everyone is convinced. I mean, there was a point that even in Toronto, very senior planners were saying there's 500,000 empty bedrooms in Ontario alone. So there's no supply shortage. It's just we have misallocated housing. And so there was complete denial of this idea that we have a supply shortage. So I'm going to ask you, Meet, is there an agreement amongst the planners and economists of a housing deficit, or are there people who are skeptic about housing supply being the problem? So over to you, Meet.
So that's an excellent question. There are supply skeptics that really don't buy into this housing supply narrative, but we've seen reports and housing experts say that to have affordable housings for younger people, for low to income, moderate income families, there needs to be more housing in areas where possible, and that is only done by being built, by building new homes. The supply skeptics argue that land in many high-cost cities is such a constraint good that it should be devoted only to affordable housing, and developing anything else will come at the expense of affordable homes. Skeptics, also dispute the notion that adding high-end housing will have little or absolutely nothing to do with housing affordability and prices in price segments in the city's housing market. Skeptics also worry about this notion of induced demand, that the more that you build houses in a specific region, the more it'll attract the more that'll attract individuals from other parts of the cities, which will typically be wealthier individuals. And in a dynamic housing system like we're seeing in the GTA, the skeptics argue that the price decrease resulting from any additional supply will be counteracted by the induced demand that will be resulted from the lower cost of housing. They also argue about this notion of spillover effects from newly constructed homes. So even though housing constructions may slow the rise of housing costs in a city, it will increase rents and trigger displacements in adjacent communities. So supply skeptics are very skeptical about this whole notion of adding supply into the market will lower the overall cost of a home. And many of these arguments are plausible, and we don't have research to fully counter any of these claims. But the preponderance of evidence does suggest that easing barriers into new construction will in fact moderate price increases and will make housing more affordable to low and moderate income families.
Excellent. So here, this is quite an interesting argument, and I think one of the things that I realized is that at one point when I was writing a column for Financial Post on this notion of housing supply, it turned out that there's more evidence, and we were looking at the academic research, at least the research that comes out of the economics fields. It suggests that wherever in cities and places where the rate of housing construction is lower, or looking at cities and jurisdictions where development processes are lengthy and more bureaucratic, or where it takes longer to get approvals for new development, housing prices rise faster in those jurisdictions than in places where housing could be built faster. So there's quite large body of literature and hardly any that refutes it. But at the same time, what skeptics say about building affordable housing as a priority rather than building any types of housing or luxury housing, I think there's merit in it. I think when we recognize that housing is more of a challenge for the lowest income or below the median household income categories, then probably the priority for us should be that when we define housing supply as a constraint, maybe focus first on affordable housing, build affordable housing first, and then do other types. And yes, there is also literature that whatever type of housing you build, there's a filtering effect. It reaches at the bottom of the market, but why not start with the bottom? And if you have to build more housing and you're building 3 million homes, why not build 1 million more affordable homes? And they'll do that as a priority. And the governments have the land and financial mechanisms to incentivize it. So I'm just gonna switch a little bit to slightly different topic. As Kiana mentioned earlier, that housing affordability challenges are a result of an imbalance between demand and supply. That is, the housing demand is exceeding housing supply. Fine. But now that we learned just recently that the federal government has announced that they will bring in 500,000 more immigrants, or 500,000 immigrants each year for the next 5 years, for a total of 1.4 million immigrants coming to us in Canada in the next 3 years. And then you see housing affordability also as a challenge. So if we have a housing deficit, what will be the impact of expanding the immigration targets? Over to you, Kiana.
It's a very, very question, Murtaza. I know that immigration is a primary delivery of population growth in Canada, and based on a number of census, immigrants and permanent residents right now account for around 23% of Canada's population. So the new numbers will be even higher, of course, and this means new demand and higher demand for housing. So on one hand, you might think that the gap, the deficit will be even higher, and we should expect that. But I also want to add that the economic activity and capital that immigrants will bring in the country would or could contribute to the supply. So the overall aggregate impact of immigration requires more thinking to balance all that. So on one hand, the demand will be higher. We need to make sure that the projections for measuring the gap accounted for the new demand, new immigrants into the country, but also considered we hopefully will experience a boost into the supply because of the new skilled laborers that we are going to have in the market as well.
Good. I mean, this is quite an opportunity as well, if you think about it. If you look at the construction industry, they have complaining of a lack of labor, construction labor. The skilled labor is in very short supply, and they have not been able to graduate as many apprentices into professionals for plumbers and electricians and you name it. So therefore, there's value in maybe streamlining immigration targets with the kind of skills. May not be as much need to bring in more engineers and other scientists, but maybe perhaps bring in individuals who are skilled in the construction industry and construction trades, who could join as apprentices and can quickly leapfrog into certified training. But the question that I have for you, Kiana, is that do new immigrants right away come in and start buying homes, or does it take them time to build credit history? Will they be involved in the ownership side of the equation, or will they be new immigrants will be involved in the rental side? Where will the pressure be first?
Well, of course, it depends what kind of a class of immigration will be admitted to Canada. I think historically, immigrants usually come, even the ones that can afford to buy right away will try to basically assimilate more, understand the city, understand their need for housing. So I would expect that the pressure would be, of course, on rental market in the beginning. So this is, of course, like for works for the majority of the cases. So, and as I said earlier, it's important to understand, like the new immigrants could be like, young professionals, all the way from, big families coming to Canada. So their housing need will be different. So, and what we see in terms of the stock of rental market, mainly constructed of smaller units, rental market, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom only, and it's ever we can find, a good 3-4 bedrooms, rental units, unless you are thinking about renting a single detached. So building more and more mixed type of housing, affordable housing, or market price housing, but still we do need to think about what we are building and adding to the both stock of the rental and ownership market in terms of what can meet the needs of the new immigrants.
Thank you. I guess Anson has something to add to this. So over to you, Anson.
Yeah, one thing we should also think about is that based on our research based on the research of Statistics Canada, there's a lot of income segregation in different neighborhoods. For example, low-income neighborhoods, majority of them are immigrants. Some of them are established immigrants. Those have been here for more than 10 years, but still 30% of people are recent immigrants. So immigrants tend to live in lower income neighborhoods. In the future, when we address this housing deficit, city planning, urban planning is important to address this sort of income segregation among different neighborhoods, because it's related to the amenities provided to these people. And basically, it's all about living quality in Canada.
Absolutely. Our colleague at the University of Toronto, Professor David Hilchansky, has a very long-standing project on these income segregation and how cities like Toronto are divided between haves and have-nots. So they have three categories of cities: where neighborhoods where incomes have grown, where incomes have remained steady, and where neighborhoods where incomes have fallen over time. And those are increasingly immigrant neighborhoods. I'm going to stay with you, Anson, and ask you a question. There's one way of supplying more housing is to build new housing, but some cities have been trying to squeeze more supply from existing housing. And what they have done is, like places like Vancouver, they have imposed vacant home taxes to see if there is a unit that is vacant for whatever reason. If the owners cannot justify a reason for keeping that unit vacant, they have asked for vacant home taxes. So they would have to pay tax. So this is one way of incentivizing vacant units to be brought into rental market. So what is your take on vacancy taxes? Do they really work? How much of an impact they have on the supply side?
So when we think about vacancy tax, in general, I would say this is not very effective, because overall we are looking at a very low vacancy in Vancouver, which implemented a vacancy tax years ago. They are looking at about 3% vacancy. So if you have all the homes occupied, you just increase the supply a little bit. But again, not all of the homes are long-term vacancy, and the tax is only based on long-term vacancy more than 180 days. Short-term vacancy is important for the market to be liquid, because people are looking for places to live. If you have no vacancy, then people cannot move. People want to live in different locations, so upgrading to other apartments, like other type of jobs, they have no place to move. So some sort of vacancy is important. And if the policy is just targeting for long-term vacancy, that just isn't enough long-term vacancy to just tackle all the housing deficit problem. We know that in Toronto there have been discussions about imposing a vacancy tax, and well, that may not be very useful as well, because vacancy in Toronto is also pretty low.
Excellent, thank you. Now I'm going to switch to Meet and ask him about the vacant home taxes. We know that Vancouver tried it. But we also know that Toronto is also looking into the option of imposing. What's the status of vacant home taxes in Toronto? Meet, over to you.
Yeah, so the city did propose a vacancy home tax, which came into effect at the beginning of this year. And similar to the idea in Vancouver, it was designed to kind of induce or increase the supply of housing in the market. So essentially the tax in Toronto, it was under the belief that if home buyers were faced with paying the tax, they would either have to A, sell the property, or B, put it up for rent. And this tax meant, like I said earlier, that it was meant to improve the supply from an existing supply base in Toronto for all those homes that are underutilized for individuals in the market that need it the most. And the bylaw came into effect earlier at the beginning of this year, and the new tax payments or the tax revenue wouldn't be payable by residents until early next year. So the true effect of the tax, one wouldn't understand or realize until early in 2023. And the city of Toronto defines a vacant home if it's been unoccupied for more than 6 months. So you may be asking, what about the snowbirds, those individuals that leave and spend winter months in warmer cities? Well, those people are accepted. Similar, the city of Toronto does have some exceptions, such as if your house is under renovations and you're no longer, and you aren't living in it for extended period of time because of renovations, then for that year, that tax is exempt for that property. But we saw in Vancouver that the vacant home tax did result in a little bit more supply in the owner-occupied stock. And some experts in Toronto believe that there are up to 10,000 vacant or units that could be subject to tax, which could raise about $55 to $65 million in revenue, which could theoretically be injected back into the market to improve housing affordability. Again, this tax is a small piece of the puzzle or a small piece of the pie when we're addressing housing supply. And in order to really make an impact, it's important that we acknowledge that this vacancy tax will not solve the affordability issues, but it'll be an important mechanism to really boost the supply and create an affordability for many.
Good. So the basic idea is that even though the units that will become available, either in the resale market or as rentals, that number will not be very large. That wouldn't be in hundreds of thousands, maybe around 10,000 or less. But that would be a small contribution, and every little bit helps in this case. And the other side of the story is that it may generate some additional revenue for the city, which is also a positive thing, that there may be some additional one, but it's not going to be a humongous revenue. I mean, the way land transfer tax for the city of Toronto created a significant flow of revenue, the vacancy tax would be no way near that. So staying with you, Meet, I'm going to ask you a question. We have set a target to build more millions of homes, 3.5 million new homes above and beyond the 2.5 million that we need to build, setting the target for something like 5 million new homes to be built between now and 2031. And that's a formidable challenge. And I, as a civil engineer, can imagine the kind of challenges. And it's not just the availability of land, it's not just the availability of construction capital or loans. It's also lumber, materials, supplies, labor, weather, all those things combined. That could be, I could imagine there could be challenges. So my question is Canada equipped to meet the challenge, given shortages with construction materials, the supply chain disruptions during COVID-19? Where would this money come from to finance the construction of 5 million homes? Will people allow, NIMBYs will they allow more construction, more intensification in their backyards, all of this? So over to you. Are we ready? Are we equipped to build these homes?
Well, we have to look at the bigger picture, and that is the global supply chain. When we looked at prior to the pandemic, we saw that the supply chain, the global supply chain, was operating at full functionality. When COVID hit, it brought restrictions, lockdowns, it brought panic buying from individuals that caused a strain on the entire global supply chain. This led to material shortages, labor shortages. We saw news outlets on ports of LA, in the Suez Canal, backlogs of supply chain, which ultimately created an increase in the cost of construction when we're talking about housing construction in specific. CMHC came out with a report earlier this year, and it said that the cost of construction for residential dwellings increased from 15 to 25% in the same quarter over the past year. And when we look at the supply chain issues, it really stems from the backlog that is induced by COVID, and the increases in the cost ultimately get spilled over into high housing prices. And if we look at the supply chain literature and discuss conversations about the supply chain with logistics and transportation experts, many come to the conclusion that if you were to shut down the supply chain, the global supply chain for a better part of the year, it takes roughly 3 to 5 years to get back to its full capacity from a production and logistics standpoint. And from my opinion, that's where what we're experiencing today is that when we discuss about these high construction costs, it stems from this backlog under the supply chain, and it doesn't correlate into lower residential house prices. In fact, these high costs translate into high residential home prices. Building materials, like you mentioned, lumber, concrete, are all materials that are all way expensive than they were in the past, and which is obviously being filtered down to higher home prices.
Absolutely. Now, I gather there are things that we can control and engineer better supply chains, but there are things that would always be out of our control. And Anson, would you like to jump into the bigger challenges that may be more daunting than just labor or supply chain shortages?
We think about building more houses for Canadians. We also have to think about building stronger, more better resilient houses for people, because we are talking about climate change associated with climate risk, more natural disasters. We have to ask ourselves, are the new builds resilient to floods or natural disasters? Are we building high quality buildings? Because research about 2016 Fort McMurray wildfire, when the city was destroyed by wildfire, people rushed to build new homes, and the buildings were not really quite up to standard reported by the media. And apparently they were not building with the foresight that there may be more climate risk in the future. So that's something we have to keep in mind when we tackle climate change.
So we're going to open now to the audience. And if I may look at the screen here, I see one question already there. I'm going to paraphrase it. And anyone from the panel can jump to answer it. And it's about the development approval processes. And for various reasons, maybe that they're not being that efficient. So the question is, how do you get better development processes? So when an application for a subdivision comes in, it doesn't take 5 years to go through the approval processes. Maybe 5 months is enough. So is there room for it? And I understand that the provincial government has incentivized municipalities to streamline their approval processes so that the bureaucratic burden on housing supply is reduced. So anyone who want to jump in?
So I certainly agree with the audience that we have to think about infrastructure, we have to think about amenities. We're just not putting people into places. We have to ask, say, in Toronto, whether the TTC or transportation system, sewage system can afford to have more people. But at the same time, there are other obstacles. Very common that people will say, yeah, let's build more houses, but not in my neighborhood. That's not in my neighborhood. Idea is that it will affect the house prices if you build multi-storage building in the neighborhood instead of single family home. That's part is bigger obstacles that will require public hearing and zoning changes, and these are things that probably maybe can be speed up in the development process, in my opinion.
Great, thank you. So I'm gonna open up the this for the audience. If people have questions, now is the time to ask any questions. And now, Pamela, can they unmute and ask, or they have to type the questions in the Q&A?
Murtaza, my understanding is they need to put them in the Q&A.
Okay.
Thanks.
So I just see one question there. And while people think about their questions and they may want to put in the questions, I think one of the challenges is for us has been in Canada that we took a longer time to realize that we have a housing deficit, and the supply side is the answer to this. It took some decades to come to this conclusion. And the second thing is that even when we realize, I don't think we have the bureaucratic setup. The approval processes are not streamlined. our supply chains are not oriented. We certainly haven't prioritized the labor force in a way that can deliver 5 million homes in 5 to 10 years. And all these constraints will remain there. So if I were to take a look into the future, I would continue to see housing prices continue to increase, and reason being that these homes that we need will not be built in time. The other thing that we haven't touched, and I'm just going to look at the questions. I don't see another question, so I'm going to pivot to a slightly relevant topic, and that is the supply of purpose-built rental housing. The home ownership is a concern. Housing affordability is a concern for those who are trying to buy a house, and obviously they are unable to buy the quality of house in the location that they want, in the neighborhood they want, and the size of the house. But at the same time, these households who are trying to buy can buy a house. It may not be as large as they wanted. It may not be in the neighborhood that they wanted. It may not have the same quality as they wanted, but they can afford to buy a house, any house. That may be slightly lower than their expectations, or much lower than their expectations. But that's where I think is not the main housing affordability challenge. The main housing affordability challenge is in the rental domain, where people who are priced out of the cheapest rental housing stock, people who cannot pay the minimum rent that places like City of Toronto demand now. So how do we address that? And one way of addressing this is to build purpose-built rental housing. So you see across on Toronto, these buildings that were built in 60s and 70s, and even before that, these are purpose-built rental housing, which provide affordable and secure shelter for individuals, so they don't have to, they have the security of tenure. That if you're a rental there, you don't fear year by year that the owner would come in and say, look, I need this place, I need to sell it, or I need to move in by myself. So not only affordable rental housing, but also the security of tenure. But the challenge is, again, from the supply side, we have not built purpose-built rental housing in Canada. To give you some numbers, in the early 70s, Ontario was building about 40,000 new purpose-built rental homes. That number declined to less than 1,000 by 1997. And it has picked up a little bit, but that's along the luxury rental side. So the question is, and this is to the panel, what do you think, what role purpose-built rental plays in improving housing affordability in Canada? And what can be done to focus on the construction of purpose-built rental as well? So over to you.
I think purpose-built rentals play a huge role in improving affordability. When Kiana was talking earlier about the immigrants come here, and most of them may end up going into the rental market, which right now, as you mentioned, there is a lack of rental dwellings that are available for individuals, and building more rental properties is helpful in the sense that it provides housing for those that don't have enough capital to go right into home ownership. And providing purpose-built rentals or rental dwellings in areas in all geographies in the GTA is really beneficial, because it creates this wide variety of housing that is affordable and applicable to everybody, and available also to everybody that is in need of housing.
Great. So here's a question. There's questions coming in, so thank you very much. I'm going to read the question, and Kiana or Anson or Meet, what can a municipality do to incentivize construction of rental apartment buildings? Is there anything in their capacity to increase it? Over to you.
It's a very, very good question. I mean, in terms of programs, wide, programs that are available, and quite honestly, like there keep coming new programs that government will try to think to sort of help the entire, considering the entire housing spectrum, like thinking about, like homelessness, all the, like home ownership. there are programs like Housing Accelerator Fund, for example, Rapid Housing Initiatives. These are all different type of programs I'm aware of at the national level, actually, to help build more purpose-built building. In terms of municipalities, though, when it comes to like a specific municipalities, when you think about it, zoning and regulation at the municipality level, you actually mentioned, like the process that it takes for getting permits, for example, these are under the jurisdiction of municipalities. Of course, reviewing those processes, of course, having sort of a best practices in terms of, I know, for example, like now what we're seeing in terms of having or making it easier to build garden suites, for example, lane homes in Toronto. This is one of those initiatives, I think, at the municipality level, for example, that could help in terms of adding to the supply. But in terms of just having the for example, stock of purpose-built, what I could think of, like each municipality looks at the stock of existing structure, for example, now in terms of offices, hotels, motels, anything else that is available, and they can think of or help, converting them to more of a purpose-built building, and sort of having the process in place could definitely help at municipality level.
Excellent. Last question to you, Anson. We have 2 minutes. And the question is, how can the governments incentivize the private sector, the builders, developers, to build more? What's in the government's tool of incentives to get more buildings, get the private sector moving? Over to you, Anson.
So one of the easiest way is just to provide tax incentives that is within the government's set of tools that without lengthy process to change your policy. So if they build rental houses, then they get tax incentives in terms of the subsidies. That would be the easiest way, in my opinion.
Excellent. I mean, if you think about it, the Canadian government for a multi-year plan is of a $70 billion housing plan, and out of which 35 billion is cash and 35 billion are incentives through loans and guarantees for loans. And some of those $35 billion are dedicated to helping the builders and developers with the construction. So it's not that the governments are not doing anything, the governments are doing, but I think the scale of the problem is so large, it's so huge that we need to rethink, and we need to realize that these things at the margin will not help, like rent to buy incentives, or with governments becoming sharing the mortgage with you, co-mortgaging with you, and all these incentives are great. They help, absolutely, but they help only at the margins. What you really need is millions more homes, and for that you have to be very aggressive in setting incentives and being more aggressive in setting not only incentives but also breaking the bureaucratic barriers between the governments. That's the only way to go forward. We will stop here and pass it over back to Professor Robinson for the concluding remarks.
I want to thank all of you for an insightful and fast-paced panel. You managed to pack a lot in to the short amount of time that you had to do your presentations today. So if folks would like to follow up, the Urban Innovation Center and the Urban Analytics Center is available to talk to you. And each of the individual faculty members, I'm sure, would also be delighted to hear from you if their research and the things they shared are resonant. I want to draw your attention to future urban innovation sessions that we're having next week. We're going to be talking about bringing ecology and food sovereignty to the rooftops in the city. So you can see, even just comparing what we talked about today and what's coming next, we've got a wide range of urban innovation expertise at our university that we're delighted to share. Thank you so much, everyone. Stay well in these odd and turbulent times. And thanks again to our colleagues who made time today to share their research. All the best. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you.